socially divided groups that live in Rwanda. The Tutsi were chosen by the Belgians to hold dominance because they were considered the higher class. In 1962, Rwanda became independent. In April 1994, an act of foul play resulted in the deaths of President Habyarimana of Rwanda and his colleague, President Terria Amir of Burundi, in a plane crash. Only hours after the plane crash, the Hutu-inspired killings began. The killings lasted for 3 months and ended with estimated deaths of 1 million people, mainly Tutsi. The Rwandan genocide forced a turning point in Rwanda's political situation, inspiring those in Rwanda to make peace and also helping others to prevent further genocide. Gather round. I'm one of the greatest journalists you will ever find. Listen to this. The greatest cause of the genocide was the Hutus' hatred of the minority Tutsi people. There were mass executions of a particular group of people. Executions that were greatly assisted by a major world power and that the rest of the world chose to ignore. Rwanda, being one of the most crowded nations in Africa, was made up of 85% Hutu, 14% Tutsi, and 1% Twa. These three groups have lived together for nearly 1,000 years. Now listen up, it gets much better. The Tutsi and Hutu groups are similar. They share the same language, culture, and religious philosophies. The massacres in Rwanda are not a result of deep-rooted hatred between two ethnic groups, but are the result of deep-rooted hatred between two socially divided groups. You cannot tell Tutsi and Hutu apart by physical appearances. In fact, during the genocide, some Hutu were mistakenly killed because they had Tutsi features, and some Tutsi could pass for Hutu because they had stereotypical Hutu features. Before independence, the Tutsi regulated and controlled the society. The Belgians used the Tutsi to control the population of Rwanda, granting them political power and education resources. The Belgians and Tutsi worked together to keep the Hutu as the poor and unskilled labor class in Rwanda. Soon, the wealthier Tutsi class could afford more cattle and became more powerful than the Hutu. Rwanda has been a Belgian colony for many years. At this time, the Tutsi were considered the higher class. The Tutsi remained dominant until 1961. On July 1st, 1962, Rwanda became independent and the Hutus took control of the government. They stripped Tutsi of their land, and by early 1964, over 150,000 Tutsi fled to neighboring countries. In 1988, the Rwandan Patriotic Front was a political and military organization created and led by Tutsi exiles in Uganda. In 1990, the Rwandan Patriotic Front began launching attacks on the Hutu government in an attempt to overthrow it. However, a peace agreement was signed by the Rwandan Patriotic Front and the Hutu government in 1993, but the government still plotted and planned the genocide of the Tutsi. Today is April 6, 1994, and I have just heard news of President Habyarimana's plane being shot down, killing him and his colleague, President Terria Amir of Burundi. Juvenile Habyarimana was elected president in late 1978, beginning a succession of 5-year terms. Within hours of the plane crash, the killings erupted in Rwanda. Now, I want you all to listen, and I want you to listen well. I suspect this act of foul play was an act of the Tutsi, and I have decided, as your colonel, that we are going to take revenge. You're dismissed. I began carrying out my plans for the genocide of the Tutsi. Many found ways to avoid participating. Most, however, joined in the killings. Those in the Hutu government who opposed the genocide were killed after contacting the United Nations. Oh, and don't worry about that. Their call for help was turned down. However, the United Nations did arrive in Rwanda, but their mission was to evacuate foreigners and leave the country, which then gave us the green light to undertake our plan of exterminating the Tutsi. It was quite simple, really. We used threats, propaganda, and the promise of land and wealth to encourage the Hutu population to attack the Tutsi. Many were given lists of names, but most were just commanded, by me, to kill anyone with a Tutsi identity card and anyone who looked Tutsi. The Tutsi became victims of massacre throughout the country. In May and June, my government was suffering military loss, and the Hutu were seizing attacks against the Tutsi. All the while, the Tutsi were gaining military power. July 4th, 1994, Rwandan Patriotic Army finally secures Kigali, ending the genocide. The Tutsi overran government forces and took control of the country. Over the last 3 months, the Hutu had killed an estimated 1,117,000 Tutsi. The majority of those who fled returned home to Rwanda, and a fragile government was set up by a Hutu leader, Bizimungu. The Rwandan Patriotic Front leader, Kagame, was put second in command. Bizimungo was soon imprisoned for trying to further the violence against the Tutsi, and Kagame took control. As a result, both the United States and the networks offered too little, too late to stop the killings. Many were heard asking, Rwanda? That's somewhere in Africa, isn't it? Anyway, the United States worked to see that the United Nations establish an international criminal court for all those in Rwanda who could be held accountable. In 1995, an International War Crimes Tribunal Court was established in Tanzania. On April 14th, 1998, 22 people convicted of genocide were publicly executed. Court is in session on the matter of the Rwandan genocide. The 3 defendants here today never actually killed anyone physically, but their words and messages played a part in the genocide. These 3 Hutu journalists here on trial had major control over newspapers, television, and radio, which they used to send out messages to the public telling them to kill the Tutsi. The International War Crimes Tribunal Court has found these 3 Hutu journalists guilty of encouraging the genocide. Order in the court, order in the court, settle down. If you cannot maintain peace and order in my court, you will be escorted out. The verdict is in, the jury has concluded, and their decision stands. Court is adjourned. Kagame was re-elected president in 2003 and in 2010. This turning point leaves Rwanda's political government tense and fragile. Now, after 1,117,000 deaths, the international community has apologized to Rwanda repeatedly. As a Tutsi survivor and published author once said, "Someday soon, I believe the world will call Rwanda great people."